We met in 2003 in New Zealand. I knew about the car, of course, being I've had Alvis since 1982, but I knew about the car and I knew about Graber and the cars that he bodied. About 5 years ago, the Alvis Club in Victoria in Australia, where I live, was having a weekend outing at a country town, and we were having a glass of beer, as one does, on the veranda before dinner, and one of the club members was passing around a copy of the magazine, and as one does, one starts at the end of the magazine and reads the ads first and then moves forward. And there in the advertising section was an ad for this 1953 Graber two-door coupe. I saw the car and it was really love at first sight. I got in touch with Nick, and Nick went down to the company and did a survey on the car for me. Anyway, Nick's report was favourable, and I then telephoned the dealer and spoke to him. He told me that he was acting on behalf of an overseas client, and we talked about price, and I thought that they wanted too much for the car. About 6 months later, my daughter, who lives in Brisbane in Australia, rang me up and said, "Did you know there's a Graber advertised on the internet? And it sounds like the one you were looking at previously." So sure enough it was. So I rang up the chap and said, "I see you haven't sold it." "But we've had inquiries," he said. I said, "Yes, but you haven't sold it. It's been 6 months." So I said, "Well, here's an offer. It's open for 7 days. Take it or leave it." And he rang back about 3 days later and said the owners accepted the offer, and that was it. And it went up to early engineering in Abergavenny, and Nick and his team did a mechanical refurbishment of it, a really good service, I think we would call it. And then my wife and I came over and we spent we had a Welsh weekend past the Brecon Beacons, and then we took it down to Cornwall for a week and drove it around there. Much loved member of the family called Mrs. Graber. It's the only Graber bodied car in Australia, and it's certainly the only Alvis Graber in Australia.
First time I actually saw a picture of a Graber bodied car, I was waiting in the doctor's waiting room when they had the autocar amongst the magazine selections, and it was the Geneva Show Report, March 1959, and it showed a picture of the latest car that he built, which was the panoramic coupe, which was long and low, little tail fins, and it had an electric rear window and a folding hood. That looked rather splendid. It was described, it was a pretty poor black and white picture, I have to say, but it was described as a crystal green coupe with magnolia upholstery and Barani wire wheels, and that sort of fired my imagination. And I looked at Alvis's later on, and eventually ended up with a 3 litre. It was a park board, but then started looking for the genuine thing.
And Graber, of course, built on the chassis of many other manufacturers. Why do you think the Alvis base was so successful?
Well, compared with other manufacturers, certainly post-war at any rate, Alvis was the only one that offered a reasonably low bonnet line, and you could get the long, low look, which you couldn't get on a Bentley or other things. There wasn't much available after the war, but the Alvis was what actually kept him busy, certainly in the late 50s and the 60s. Yes. And those are the ones that look the best. Yes.
So we're now talking about Richard's car. Its year of manufacture was
53, and the body was built in 54.
So when we look at the picture of that car, we've really got to consider what its contemporaries looked like. What would its contemporary in the Alvis field be next?
Well, the standard Alvis available at that time was the 3 litre, in particular the TA21 and I think probably the TC21 at that time, but they all used Mulliner coachwork or Tickford coachwork, as standard coachwork, but the vehicle was available as a chassis.
Yeah.
I think Graber had a small relationship with Alvis for a few years. I think he built a couple of TA14s at one stage, and he seemed to have a better engineering concept for building coachwork. It was slightly less traditional in design than the English coachwork. English coachwork tended to follow traditional lines with wood frames that were sort of built like greenhouses in a funny sort of way. And they did have their problems, particularly the TA, when they'd done a few miles. The front of the chassis would twist, and you can see on one that's done a lot of mileage, the radiator will wobble backwards and forwards as you sort of hit the bumps and things like that. And Graber worked out a system of triangulating the substructure of the coachwork, and it began with his early 3 litres, so that the body acted as a sort of integral structure over the top of the chassis. And if you look at Richard's car, if he opens the bonnet, you can see that the panels, the engine bay panels, are a solid structure from the bulkhead right forward to the radiator on both sides, and then down onto the chassis. So they help to prevent the front of the car from twisting. And as we found out to our cost when we took the windscreen out to restore the car, you have to take the dashboard out, the instrument panel out, to replace the windscreen. I found out that the way it's fitted in, it's screwed the whole way along the windscreen rim and down the sides, and it is a stress member for the car and part of the bulkhead. And he built the whole car that way. When you look at the boot panels, and there are inner wing panels on the rear wings in the boot, these all add to the stiffness of the structure. And I found that car handled like a dream compared with an elderly standard UK one, just simply because the body was taut from one end to the other, even in old age. Because when they came onto the TD21 later, they, in actual fact, Parkwoods deleted that arrangement on the rear of the car, but they did actually use it for the front end of the car in much the same way, which is why the front wings on this car and later Parkwood cars are bolted the whole way around the rim under the bonnet aperture. The Mulliner coachwork of that period still had the door hinges on the outside of the car. You know, these sort of pre-war glass panels over the windows and things like that. This car has completely concealed hinges, and so it's but the previous, he built 9, I think, in the TAs.
Yes.
And I think all the rest were drop heads.
They were
convertibles.
Yes. So it was the only coupe on the TA chassis.
Yes.
And it was done for the March show, I think, when it appeared. And I suspect, I don't know, this is not fact, but probably he was trying to expand into coupes as opposed, in addition to drop heads, to give him another line to sell, I suppose.
So he built the car, he built the body in 2 or 3 months, because I believe Alvis delivered it to him on New Year's Day in 1954. So if the Geneva show was in March, he did the whole thing and got it ready for the show in a couple of months.
They were always shown at Geneva. That was his showcase.
Yes.
And he always took advertising in the Automobile Review. So he always tended to be on the front or on the inside cover. So it was always highly anticipated what he was going to produce for the show.
And how did that car compare price-wise with the other cars on the show?
I think, I don't know about in the 50s, but certainly when in the late 50s and the early 60s, the premium over a Parkwood wasn't that much, was it?
I honestly don't know.
I think it was only about 20%, if that.
So a 20% increase in the cost there, it's a significant amount.
Yeah. But it would be bespoke. There wouldn't be another one like it.
Yes. If
You were asking before about what was different about the car.
Yeah.
If you look at the dashboard, Graber was presumably presented with an Alvis TA21 dashboard, and the Alvis TA21 dashboard has the because it has no tacho, but it has the speedo in the middle,
Yes.
and it has the minor instruments on either side of the speedo, and the switches and knobs are spaced out evenly on either side. So if you've got the speedo in the middle and you in front of the driver are a couple of dials and some of the switches. What he's done with my car is to leave the speedo in the middle, but to put all of the other instruments on the and dials and switches on the right hand side, and all that is on the left is a radio. And Nick, I'm not sure whether you put that in or it was there originally. It was it's a tape player, an audio tape player. I don't know whether they had those in 1953-4, but at some stage it's had an audio tape player and a radio. A transistor radio put into it to the left of the speedo. But otherwise the instruments are more grouped in front of the driver than they are on the Muller and the Tippett cars.
One interesting thing you just said outside, Nick, is that Richard's car has got no radiator cap externally, which the Alvis cars had. There's a picture of a convertible here, which does have a radiator cap.
Yes, I suspect that he decided to try and move on from that because they may have been troublesome as they were, but on this one it came with a with a proper AC turned down £4 cap, which is a much better arrangement, much more reliable than the original arrangement.
And of course it improves to some extent the engine cooling as well.
It does.
I filmed it.
Oh, that'd be fun.
So,
I take it it's a silent.
no, it's got sound.
It's got sound on it as well. Isn't it an incredible coincidence that the three of you are sitting together, Cara's there as well, but particularly going back to the fact that Nick worked in the car and owned the car. So let's tell us about your ownership of it and what you did with it.
Well, I first got introduced into the world of Graber somewhere around about 1974 or something like that, when John had invited or arranged for some Swiss owners to come over with their cars. I might be hazy on the date there, but I was pretty impressed with these when they turned up at Alvis Day. And then the next year, when there was a Graber meeting, I arranged with John to figure out how to go over there and attend the meeting, which I did. And it was great fun, and I really liked the cars, you know, having already got a Park Ward. And like him, the ambition sort of settled in there. Then I went again the following year, and I was talking about trying to find one of these cars, and the prices that came up were totally, you know, no use at all. At that stage we were building a house and children at school and one thing and another. But while I was there, I was talking to a chap I'd made great friends with, a chap called Christian Mertz, who John knows very, very well, who's been into Grabers for probably nearly as long as he has. And he said, well, I know where there's an old one. He said, we'll see, Madame Graber's got one in her garage. He said, you know, I'll try and arrange an appointment to go and have a chat with her. And of course she was the sort of holy grail of Graber. She went to the meetings and treated like the sort of goddess of Graber. And so we did actually have a very pleasant meeting, and she invited us around for tea. So Pat and I went and had tea with her and her sister and some rather ancient dogs, and we sort of eventually, in sort of broken French, because I couldn't speak any German, she eventually took us around to look at this thing, which was in the garage, and she said, well, look, that'd be fine, but you know, if I'm going to let you have even a look at it, you know, could you do a couple of jobs on my two cars? At that time she had a Delahaye with a Graber body on, and her husband's Alvis Graber, and in fact she didn't need much doing. They just wanted starting and running and the batteries charging and the tyres blowing up, and generally checked over. And then she took me into another garage where the car was parked. It was looking very forlorn. It had obviously been left outside prior to that for probably a few years, I would say. It was well rain soaked inside, and the gold paint was peeling off in huge lumps. You could actually just get hold of it with your finger and pull it off. But anyway, some sort of a price was agreed to, and it was affordable, and it was arranged that she would keep the car until the next year, when I could get another 2 weeks holiday and come out armed with a cylinder head and some brake cylinders and all the things that were needed to get it into running order, having done a survey on it, which we did. And it was then driven back quietly to the UK, and not a lot happened for the first year. It just sort of sat there while we tried to decide what to do with it. And then I did I can't remember the year, it might have been 77 or 78, I did a sort of a repaint and recommissioning and got it going, and showed it for the first time at one of the Nebworth events, I think it was.
Was it blue at that stage?
It was blue at that stage, yeah. When it came to me, it had obviously been gold most of its life with a black roof. And so the paint that was on it must have been painted a few times because it was really thick, and it peeled off, and then we thought, well, we're just going to get all this paint off and start again and find what's underneath, because there were a few.
It was used as a works hack.
They used it to pull the trailer to collect cars, and
it wasn't even a loan car, was it? It was just it literally was a sort of a tow
I think it had. I don't know who, but somebody had told me they thought it had been a loan car, but it had gone even further down to the point where it pulled their trailer, which I think they went for supplies with it and things like that. And the first job we did was to get the springs off and get it back to standard again. It had an extremely low ratio axle in it, and a second axle came with it. And Mr. Hess, who owned or was running the Graber garage at the time, because they still serviced Alvis's then, had said to me, that this is the axle that belongs with it. So we had to go back another year with a truck, all the way to go and get it. I couldn't get it in the back of the car, it was just too big. So we put it all back together and got it running, and it ran pretty well then. But there was an engine issue with it. Whilst it drove back from Switzerland to England okay, it consumed enormous amounts of oil. And we looked at it, and I found it hadn't got the original engine in it. It got a TA engine from another car in it, which was from an English Mulliner. So I don't know where that came from. And I then bought a TC21 100 engine and overhauled it to put it in when it had the first repaint. And I think that's the engine that's still in it today.
So you repainted it, and what colour?
It was dark blue at that time,
right.
Sort of like a navy blue colour.
So when did it change back to its original gold colour?
I did that in the 1991 rebuild. We really took it apart. There was a lot of rust in it. The boot floor was non-existent. It wasn't connected to the sort of rounded back of the car. And when you went over bumps, all sorts of things shook and rattled. And we replaced some wood door pillars and things like that on the driver's side. Took all the paint off back to bare metal, repaired all sorts of areas, and what's
the construction of the body shell?
It's mostly steel, but there are wood elements in it. It would be much the same way as a Park Ward. And I think in actual fact the Park Ward versions, which were much later, adopted the general principles of design, because it has 4 door posts, and from the B posts you have this sort of what Alvis would call an elbow rail, which goes from the back of it right under the rear side windows, round the back continuously, and back to the pillar on the other side. And the whole body sort of hangs on. That acts as the tacking rail for the back deck under the rear window, and for the roof, which comes down to it. And they both meet at that point like that, and the timber crosses underneath. And it was nailed round there. It had things like tin tacks all the way round there. And then that chromium bead that's sort of right around I can't remember how far around it goes now. There's quite a long chromium bead that goes right around. That actually covers the seam from one end to the other. The doors are steel.
Yes. Yeah.
and they're heavy. If you've got to watch if the wind blows them shut while you're trying to get out.
So the doors have got a wooden structure with
they
the
have full
the panels
wooden structure.
Yes.
In the same way that the early Park Wards were.
Richard, how do you find the car drives now?
I've had my two reasonably large friends on the tour with me in the boot and a part of the back seat full of luggage. So it's she's been a little Queen Mary-ish because of that. Last night I drove down to your friend Willie Beattie's tyre garage down about a quarter of an hour from where we were staying near Oban to about a tyre issue, and there was a lovely twisty road between where we were staying and there, and it took 15 minutes there and back, and just me on board, and it was lovely. It was just
if you did that in 15 minutes, you were motoring.
Well, and the road's being repaired too, so I had to slow down a bit, but without a heavy load like that, I think it handles very nicely. I've got radials on it, and it seems to suit. They seem to suit it well, and it handles very nicely. I suppose the only thing that I find, having owned a TE21 with a 5-speed ZF box, I find the box, the Alvis box, chunky, and it's always a little irritating to have to get into first gear with no synchro and the lights. Nick would be able to do it far more smoothly than I would, but you put it into second and first, and then you put it into first. But with the ZF box in it, it would be truly wonderful. But that isn't
original.
But that isn't permitted. That isn't permitted. No.
Well, you say that, but if
he says that. Nick told me that.
Yes, if you're a customer of Mr. Graber,
he
would have said, "Well, you'll find this better."
Yeah,
that's true. He did convert some of the later cars, but in actual fact, it's very, very difficult to put the ZF box in an early chassis because the mountings are different.
Take the TF box out of that and put it in the Graber. And I sent Nick an email and said, well, is this possible and could I do it? And he emailed me back and said something to the effect of, there are 3 reasons why you can't do it. One, as he just said, it's very difficult. 2, the AOC would probably expel you for molesting a perfectly good and somewhat historic car. And 3, I'd never speak to you again. The last one, the last one was the one that clinched it. But she is not going to be molested, no.
You've brought it all the way from Australia back for this tour.
My 2 members of my crew, David Stagg and John Lincoln, I have jointly brought the car over for the specifically for this rally. Yes.